Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Today we'll delve into the shadows of the Kentucky Appalachians, where two sisters built a legacy that history books have chosen to forget. Comment on where you're watching from now, because this narrative will take you to places that collective memory has tried to erase. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Kentucky, 1912. The Appalachian Mountains stood like ancient sentinels, guarding secrets that only the wind dared whisper. In that region of deep valleys and dense forests, where civilization still struggled to take root, entire communities lived by their own rules. Geographic isolation created pockets of society where federal law seemed more of a distant suggestion than an applicable reality. The roads were dirt tracks that turned into rivers of mud during the torrential spring rains. Communication between counties took days, sometimes weeks. In this scenario of isolation and forced self-sufficiency, some figures emerged from the shadows to leave indelible marks on the regional memory. Mary and Ruby Ashcroft were 20 years old when their reputation began to spread through the mountains like wildfire. Twin sisters, born in a log cabin in the heart of County Harlan, they grew up in an environment where survival depended more on cunning than compassion. Their father had been a miner before an accident in the underground tunnels left him incapacitated. Their mother sewed clothes for wealthier families in the region, but the money was never enough. The sisters learned early on that the world did not reserve kindness for those born without resources. They then developed their own philosophy, a worldview where kindness was weakness and pity, a luxury that only fools could afford to feel. What made Mary and Ruby particularly intriguing was the way they operated. They weren't impulsive or reckless. On the contrary, every move seemed calculated with mathematical precision. They attracted people's trust with disconcerting ease. Mary possessed a smile that disarmed even the most suspicious, while Ruby had the gift of gab, capable of convincing anyone of practically anything. Together they formed a duo that seemed to have been forged in some dark pact with forces we prefer not to name. Accounts from the time describe how they moved through the mountain communities, always leaving a trail of unanswered questions and mysteriously empty coffers. The first property they acquired was near the Cumberland River, a two-story wooden building that had belonged to a tobacco merchant. No one knew for sure how two young women with no apparent fortune had managed to buy the property, but county records confirmed the transaction. The house quickly became a meeting point for travelers crossing the mountains. Mary and Ruby offered lodging, hot meals, and pleasant conversation. Their skills as hostesses were undeniable. Guests praised the food, the comfort of the beds, and the sisters' warm hospitality. But some of these visitors never completed their journeys. They simply vanished into the mountain mists, leaving behind only their belongings and the echo of their last conversations. The locals began to whisper. Something was wrong with that house by the river. The sisters seemed to thrive while others struggled just to survive. Their closets were filled with fine clothes, their pantries overflowed with provisions, and small luxuries appeared with suspicious frequency. Jewelry that didn't match the simple mountain style. Pocket watches from European brands. Leather suitcases engraved with initials that weren't Ashcroft. When questioned, Mary and Ruby always had plausible explanations. Gifts from grateful guests, inheritances from distant relatives, finds at flea markets. The truth, however, always seemed to dance a step beyond the reach of any serious investigation. The sheriff of Harlan County, a man named Thomas Brennan, began receiving letters from worried families. Husbands who had left for work in the mines and never arrived. Merchants transporting valuable goods who vanished without a trace. They all had something in common. Their last known stops were at the Ashcroft Sisters Inn. Brennan visited the property several times, always greeted with hot tea and kind smiles. Mary and Ruby cooperated fully, showing him their ledgers, answering questions with angelic patience. The sheriff never found anything incriminating. No physical evidence, no direct testimony, just that nagging feeling that gnawed at his insides every time he left that house. In 1912, the situation began to intensify in ways that even the sisters couldn't fully control. A lawyer from Louisville was investigating the whereabouts of a client who had disappeared months earlier. The man carried important documents and a considerable sum of money. His last correspondence mentioned that he would spend a night at the Ashcroft Inn before crossing the mountains towards Virginia. The lawyer was not like the local sheriffs. easily distracted or intimidated by regional politics. He brought with him resources, contacts, and a determination that came from outside that isolated mountain world. His arrival in Harlan marked the beginning of a new phase in this dark story, a phase where carefully guarded secrets would begin to crack under increasing pressure. The Ashcroft sisters realized the net was closing in, not in obvious ways, but through subtle signs that only those living on the fringes of the law can detect. Longer glances in the streets, conversations that abruptly ceased when they entered commercial establishments. The tension in the air was shifting, like that heavy stillness that precedes devastating mountain storms. Mary and Ruby, always so confident in their ability to manipulate situations, now faced something different. It wasn't just local distrust. It was the weight of an outside world that was beginning to turn its attention to that forgotten corner of Kentucky. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of this story. Leave a like if you're enjoying this journey through the shadows of the past. And in the comments, tell us what you think really happened in that house by the River Cumberland. The Ashcroft Sisters Inn functioned like a living organism, breathing in the secrets of the mountains and exhaling an atmosphere that oscillated between welcoming and unsettling. The wooden walls creaked in the wind that descended from the highest peaks, creating a nocturnal symphony that few guests could ignore. Mary had decorated the interior with surprising taste for someone raised in the ruggedness of the Appalachians. Velvet curtains covered the windows, Persian rugs adorned the wide plank floors, and oil paintings of European landscapes decorated the walls. Everything seemed out of place in that mountainous setting, as if pieces of another world had been transplanted into that isolated reality. Ruby commanded the kitchen with a mastery that rivaled the best restaurants in Lexington. Her stews were famous in the region. Spices that no one could quite identify danced on the palates of visitors. She had the peculiar habit of conversing at length with guests during meals, extracting information with the delicacy of someone picking wildflowers. She asked about their origins, their destinations, the people who awaited them, all wrapped in a layer of genuine interest that rarely aroused suspicion. The travelers, tired from days on the road, happy to find an oasis of civilization amidst the wildness of the mountains, opened their hearts and their stories without realizing that each word was carefully catalogued in Ruby's sharp mind. The Louisville lawyer, a middle-aged man named Jonathan Pierce, arrived in the area on a cloudy October afternoon. He carried a leather briefcase worn with use, and an expression that mixed determination with weariness. Pierce was not easily impressed. He had seen the worst aspects of human nature in his decades of legal practice: elaborate frauds, family betrayals, crimes that polite society preferred to pretend didn't exist. When he knocked on the door of the inn, he was greeted by Mary with that smile so many had described, but her trained professional eyes captured something others missed: a microscopic coldness behind the cordiality. Like a thin layer of ice on running water, the sisters knew who he was even before he introduced himself. News traveled slowly through the mountains, but eventually it arrived. A prominent lawyer asking questions about missing persons represented exactly the kind of threat they had learned to avoid. But refusing lodging would be an unspoken admission of guilt, an amateurish move neither of them would make. So Mary led Pierce upstairs to the room with the best view of the valley, where the Cumberland River meandered like a silver snake between the oak and pine-covered slopes. Ruby prepared a particularly lavish dinner, serving it herself while Pierce ate in silence, watching, always watching. During the meal, Pierce casually mentioned the purpose of his visit. He was seeking information about a client who had passed through the region months before, a merchant of fine fabrics transporting valuable goods destined for shops in Bristol, Tennessee. The man had sent a letter to his wife mentioning that he would be staying overnight at the Ashcroft Sisters Inn before continuing his journey. After that, absolute silence. No further correspondence, no record of arrival in Bristol, no trace. Pierce carefully observed Mary and Ruby's reactions as he spoke, but the sisters were masters of emotional control. They expressed appropriate concern, consulted their records, and confirmed that yes, the merchant had been there but had left early the following morning, apparently in good health and spirits. The following days brought a delicate dance of investigation and evasion. Pierce wandered the property, asking seemingly innocent questions of the nearest neighbors, examining the roads that snaked up the mountain. The sisters maintained their routines with military precision, never showing nervousness, always available to help with information that, curiously, never led anywhere. There was an almost theatrical quality to those interactions, as if everyone involved were following an unwritten script, each aware of their role in the performance. The lawyer represented civilized law and order. The sisters personified rural hospitality and innocence, wounded by implicit accusations. And in the surrounding mountains, silent witnesses observed without speaking. A chance discovery changed the course of the investigation. Pierce was examining the surroundings of the property when he noticed, partially hidden under dense foliage, a pile of seemingly discarded personal belongings. Old suitcases with broken locks, men's clothing torn and soiled with dirt, some documents deteriorated by dampness, nothing directly incriminating, but suspicious enough to warrant more direct questioning. When he confronted the sisters, they explained that travelers often left behind damaged belongings and that they simply accumulated them with the intention of eventually disposing of them properly. The explanation made superficial sense, but left a bitter taste that no amount of logic could completely dissolve. Sheriff Brennan, pressured by Pierce's presence and the growing unrest in the community, decided to conduct a more thorough inspection of the inn. It was 1912, and investigative methods were still primitive compared to future standards, but Brennan had instincts honed by years of patrolling those isolated valleys. He brought 2 deputies with him and spent hours examining every room, every cupboard, every loose floorboard. The sisters watched with studied patience, offering tea and biscuits, never impeding access to any area. Brennan found exactly what they wanted him to find. Nothing. Or rather, nothing that could be presented as concrete evidence of a crime. Strange objects, yes, minor inconsistencies, certainly, but nothing a prosecutor could use in court. Pierce's frustration was palpable. He knew with that visceral certainty that transcends the need for material proof that something profoundly wrong was happening on that property. But knowing and proving were 2 different worlds, especially in a region where the law relied more on local testimony than forensic evidence, and no one was willing to testify against the Ashcroft sisters. Fear, perhaps, or loyalty to that unwritten code of the mountains, where internal problems were solved internally, without the interference of outside authorities. Pierce spent another week in the region, conducting interviews, following leads that invariably went cold before leading him to any useful destination. The growing tension began to affect even the sisters, though they never admitted it publicly. Ruby developed a habit of waking in the middle of the night, pacing the dark hallways of the inn like a watchful spectre. Mary began compulsively checking the locks on the doors and windows, a ritual she repeated multiple times before finally allowing herself to sleep. They whispered in the corners of the house, planning, always planning. The world was changing around them. The mountains that had once offered protection through isolation now seemed to be closing in like a trap. Roads were being improved, facilitating access for authorities. Telegraph lines were beginning to connect previously completely isolated communities. Time was running out for that way of life that existed in the shadows between law and anarchy. The nights in the Appalachians carried a particular quality of darkness, dense and absolute, where the stars seemed the only reliable witnesses to earthly events. In the inn, the oil lamps created islands of yellowish light that barely managed to penetrate the furthest corners of the rooms. Mary had developed a meticulous routine of lighting each lamp in precise sequence at dusk, as if performing a ritual that kept invisible forces at bay. Ruby watched from the kitchen, her hands always busy peeling potatoes or kneading bread, but her attention focused on the sounds of the night that seeped through the wooden walls. Pierce left one November morning, carrying more questions than answers. Before leaving, he stopped at the inn's porch and addressed the sisters with a clarity that dispensed with subtlety. He said he knew, deep in his soul, that something terrible had happened there. He couldn't prove it, not yet, but he would keep searching. Mary responded with that smile that had become her trademark, wishing him a good trip and saying she hoped he would find peace in his search. Ruby remained silent, her dark eyes fixed on the lawyer until he disappeared around the bend in the dusty road. When they were alone again, the sisters exchanged a look that contained volumes of non-verbal communication, a particular language developed over 20 years of absolute complicity. Winter arrived with a vengeance that year, transforming the mountains into a white labyrinth of snow and ice. The roads became impassable, completely isolating the inn from the rest of the world for weeks. No guests arrived. No traveler dared to brave the storms that swept through the valleys with primal fury. Mary and Ruby lived in a bubble of silence, broken only by the crackling of the fireplace and the incessant howling of the wind. It was as if nature had decided to grant them a period of forced seclusion, a time to reflect on the choices that had brought them there. But reflection was never the Ashcroft sisters' strong suit. They were creatures of action, driven by a pragmatic philosophy that left no room for regrets or moral questioning. During those frigid months, rumors began to circulate through the mountain communities about the persistence of resistant viruses. They said the inn was cursed, that restless spirits roamed its corridors during the early hours of the morning. Some swore they had heard mournful voices when passing by the property after nightfall. Others spoke of strange lights dancing in the second-floor windows, even when everyone knew the sisters were asleep. Appalachian folklore had always had room for ghost stories and hauntings, and the Ashcroft Inn quickly became fertile ground for these popular narratives. Mary and Ruby ignored the rumors with aristocratic disdain, but even they couldn't deny that something had changed in the way their neighbors treated them. When spring finally melted the snows and reopened the mountain passes, the inn reopened its doors to travelers. But the flow of guests had decreased drastically. People avoided that route whenever possible, preferring longer paths that bypassed the sisters' property. The few who still stopped there did so out of absolute necessity, staying only the strictly necessary time before continuing their journey. Mary noticed the barely disguised fear in the eyes of these reluctant visitors, the way they compulsively checked their bags and belongings, how they slept with knives under their pillows. Ruby noticed how the conversations had changed, becoming monosyllabic and cautious, devoid of the intimacy that had once flowed so easily. Reputation, the sisters discovered, was a fragile entity that took years to build and only moments to crumble. They had invested so much effort in creating a facade of impeccable hospitality, and now they saw this carefully constructed image disintegrating under the weight of growing suspicion. The money that had once flowed in relative abundance began to dwindle. Expenses continued, but income dwindled. For the first time in years, Mary found herself counting pennies and calculating how long her savings would last. Ruby began to talk about leaving Kentucky behind and starting over somewhere where no one knew their names or their stories. But leaving would mean admitting defeat, and neither of them was prepared to make that concession. In 1913, a Louisville newspaper published a lengthy article about missing travelers in the eastern Appalachian region. The journalist, a man named Frederick Hammond, had spent months investigating patterns in reported disappearances over the past few decades. Although he didn't explicitly mention the Ashcroft sisters, the geographical description was specific enough for any reader familiar with the region to identify the inn as one of the focal points of the investigation. The article circulated widely, being reprinted in several smaller newspapers throughout Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. The unwanted attention that Pierce had brought months earlier now multiplied exponentially, transforming what was local suspicion into a regional scandal. Mary reacted to the negative publicity with a surprising strategy. She wrote a public letter to the Louisville newspaper, vehemently denying any involvement in criminal activity and inviting journalists to visit her inn to personally verify the impeccable conditions of the establishment. The letter was published and generated heated debate among readers. Some admired her courage in confronting public accusations, interpreting it as a sign of innocence. Others saw the letter as evidence of unwarranted arrogance, the kind of audacity only the truly guilty would display. Ruby disapproved of the strategy, arguing that drawing more attention was the exact opposite of what they needed, but Mary insisted that the best defense was offense, that hiding would only confirm suspicions. Hammond accepted the invitation. He arrived on a sunny June afternoon, accompanied by a photographer carrying bulky equipment in wooden crates. The sisters received them with all the pomp they could muster, offering an elaborate banquet and conducting a detailed tour of the entire property. Hammond asked sharp questions disguised as journalistic curiosity, observing reactions, cataloguing minor inconsistencies. The photographer captured images of the inn, of the sisters posing on the porch with forced smiles, of the impeccably arranged rooms. The resulting article was surprisingly balanced, presenting both the accusations and the denials without taking explicit sides. But the photographs, when published, showed something that words could not fully convey. There was a disturbing quality to those images, a sense that something essential remained hidden just beyond the camera's reach. The years began to weigh on the sisters, in ways that youth and determination could no longer mask. Mary developed a persistent cough that no home remedy could alleviate. Ruby noticed that her hair was losing its original black luster, silver strands appearing with alarming frequency. The inn, once so meticulously maintained, began to show signs of neglect. Loose floorboards, damp stains on the walls, curtains faded by the relentless sun of the mountain summers. It was as if the physical structure reflected the inner wear and tear of its owners, a parallel deterioration that no one could completely stop. The mountains remained indifferent, eternal silent witnesses to the human dramas unfolding on their slopes. The autumn of 1914 brought with it a melancholy that seemed to permeate every leaf that fell from the trees surrounding the inn. The Ashcroft sisters watched from the veranda as the world around them continued to turn, indifferent to their particular anxieties. Mary began to devote long hours to writing in a leather-bound diary that she kept locked in a secret drawer in her room. Ruby never asked what her sister wrote about with such devotion, respecting that space of privacy in a relationship that otherwise knew no secrets. There was a tacit understanding between them that certain things needed to remain unspoken so that they could continue to function as the perfect unit they had always been. The war in Europe was beginning to dominate conversations even in that remote corner of the United States. The few travelers who still stopped at the inn brought news of distant conflicts that seemed too abstract to be real. Mary and Ruby listened with feigned politeness, but their minds were occupied with battles far closer and more personal. The struggle for financial survival, for maintaining a reputation already irreparably tarnished, for preserving a way of life they knew was coming to an end. The world was modernizing at a speed that was making old ways of life obsolete. Better roads brought more witnesses. Telegraphs eliminated the isolation that had once protected secrets. The future had no room for people like them. An unexpected event brought a brief glimmer of hope for renewal. A Cincinnati businessman expressed interest in buying the property to transform it into a mountain resort, aimed at wealthy tourists seeking authentic Appalachian experiences. The man visited the lodge accompanied by an architect and an accountant, examining the structure with eyes that saw only commercial potential, blind to the shadows that permeated every corridor. Mary negotiated shrewdly, inflating the property's value with arguments about its prime location and solid construction. Ruby prepared meals that impressed the visitors, demonstrating the establishment's gastronomic potential. For a few days, the sisters allowed themselves to dream of new beginnings, of the possibility of leaving Kentucky behind and reinventing their identities somewhere where the past could not reach them. But the deal fell apart when the accountant conducted a more thorough investigation into the property's history. He uncovered the newspaper articles, the unresolved suspicions, the persistent rumors that clung to the inn like moss on damp stones. The businessman unceremoniously withdrew his offer, leaving with empty promises of reconsideration that everyone knew were merely social courtesy. Mary tore the rejection letter into tiny pieces, letting the fragments fly out the window like tragic confetti. Ruby said nothing, only returned to the kitchen and made a strong tea which they drank in silence as twilight transformed the mountains into ink silhouettes against a violet sky. The loneliness of the inn became almost tangible in those days. Weeks passed without a single guest. The sisters began to talk less to each other, each lost in her own mental labyrinths. Mary spent hours sitting on the porch, watching the road with an expression that mixed hope and resignation. Ruby developed the habit of taking long walks along the mountain trails, disappearing for hours on end and returning with her dress soiled with dirt and dry leaves stuck in her hair. There was a quality of slow disintegration in their routines, as if the accumulated weight of years of tension was finally beginning to crack the facade they had maintained so carefully. On a particularly cold December night, a fire broke out in the barn adjacent to the inn. The flames rose with alarming speed, illuminating the entire valley with an ominous orange glow. Mary and Ruby rushed to try and control the fire, but there wasn't enough water, nor was there enough help nearby. They watched helplessly as the barn was consumed, the beams collapsing with crashes that echoed through the mountains like thunder. When the nearest neighbors finally arrived, they found the sisters covered in soot, their faces illuminated by the still burning embers, indecipherable expressions etched on their features. No one could tell if they were crying or laughing, if this disaster represented tragedy or liberation. The investigation into the cause of the fire was superficial. Sheriff Brennan, now visibly aged and weary from years of dealing with situations beyond his comprehension, concluded it had been accidental, a knocked-over lamp perhaps, or poorly extinguished cigarette embers. But rumors whispered of arson, of the sisters destroying evidence that could ultimately incriminate them. Others speculated that unseen enemies had decided to take justice into their own hands. The truth, like so many other truths in that story, remained buried under layers of speculation and the impossibility of verification. The loss of the barn represented yet another financial blow that the sisters could barely bear. Their insurance was minimal, insufficient for reconstruction. Mary began selling personal belongings to cover basic expenses. Jewelry was taken to pawn shops in neighboring towns. Fine furniture gradually disappeared from the rooms. Ruby accepted occasional work sewing for local families, a humiliation she swallowed with wounded pride but imperative necessity. The inn that had once teemed with activity and prosperity was now just an empty shell, inhabited by two women who were becoming shadows of their former selves. There were moments of surprising tenderness between them during this period of decline. Mary would pull Ruby into the empty room to dance to melodies only they could hear, twirling under the dusty chandelier, as if they were still young, full of unfulfilled promises. Ruby would gently comb Mary's hair with maternal delicacy, undoing knots and braiding with the same fingers that had performed far less gentle tasks. In those moments, it was possible to see beyond the layers of hardness they had built, to glimpse the people they could have been under different circumstances. But such moments were brief, quickly swallowed by the unforgiving reality of their situations. Spring 1915 arrived with renewed promises that nature always brings, but which often fail to materialize for those trapped in downward spirals. Wildflowers burst into vibrant colors across the hillsides. Birds returned with joyful songs. The Cumberland River ran full and silvery under the rising sun. But the inn remained gloomy, its windows closed against the light, its doors rarely opened for any purpose other than strict necessity. The Ashcroft sisters had become voluntary prisoners of their own creation, watching the world continue without them through gaps in the faded curtains. Summer brought sweltering heat that settled in the valleys like a heavy, inescapable physical presence. Mary had developed the habit of sitting on the wooden floor of the upper hallway during the hottest afternoons, when the heat made any movement a Herculean effort. Ruby watched her sister during these moments of lethargy with growing concern, noticing how Mary's eyes seemed focused on distances that couldn't be measured in meters or kilometers. There was a quality of absence in that gaze, as if an essential part of her sister was gradually migrating to some other plane of existence. Their conversations had become fragmented, composed more of meaningful pauses than actual words. Ruby prepared meals that Mary only nibbled at without real appetite. Mary leafed through books without truly reading, her fingers tracing the printed letters as if they were arcane symbols whose meaning had been lost. The leather-bound diary remained closed, its last entry dating back weeks. The inn breathed around them with the slow rhythm of a dying organism, each creak of the floorboard sounding like a weary sigh, each current of air carrying the bittersweet scent of inevitable decay. A lone traveler appeared in August, breaking months of near-total isolation. He was an itinerant painter who roamed the Appalachians capturing landscapes on canvases that he then sold in urban galleries. He brought with him a contagious enthusiasm for the natural world, speaking reverently of the unique colors of that mountainous region, of how the light filtered through the morning mist created effects that no other geography could replicate. Mary and Ruby welcomed him with a worn version of their former hospitality, offering a clean room and honest food, though without the elaborate flourishes of times past. The painter stayed for a week, setting up his easel at different points around the property. His canvases captured views of the valley that the sisters had looked at 1,000 times, but never truly seen. He had a gift for extracting beauty from elements they considered merely functional, transforming ordinary trees into dramatic characters, ordinary rocks into monumental sculptures. Ruby spent hours watching him work, fascinated by the way his hands translated perception into pigment. Mary avoided watching, disturbed by the way he managed to reveal layers of meaning she had preferred to keep hidden. When the painter left, he left the sisters a small canvas as additional payment for their lodging. It was a depiction of the inn at dusk, with the second-floor windows gleaming like golden eyes against the dark mass of the structure. There was something unsettling about the image, a quality that transcended mere visual representation. The painter had captured not only the physical appearance of the building, but also its psychological atmosphere, that sense of hidden secrets that even passing strangers could detect. Mary hung the painting in the main room, where they could see it daily, an artistic mirror reflecting truths that words could not articulate. Autumn arrived with its familiar palette of reds and golds, but that year the colors seemed particularly intense, almost aggressive in their vibrancy. Ruby began to speak more openly about leaving, about selling the property for whatever they could get, and starting over in some big city where they could lose themselves in anonymous crowds. Mary resisted, bound by invisible chains to that piece of land that had been the stage for so much. They said that roots grow deeper in soil stained by extreme experiences, and Mary felt those roots holding her with a force that defied logic or reason. During a particularly violent storm in October, part of the roof collapsed under the pressure of winds that howled like enraged entities. Rainwater flooded the second floor, ruining wooden floors and creating permanent stains on the already deteriorated walls. Mary and Ruby worked frantically to contain the damage, placing buckets under multiple leaks, moving furniture to drier corners, salvaging what they could of their increasingly meager belongings. When the storm finally passed, it left behind an even more compromised inn, closer to the total collapse that now seemed not only possible, but inevitable. Sheriff Brennan visited after the storm, officially to check if they needed assistance. He brought no charges or investigative questions, only an expression of shared weariness with those two women who had consumed so much of his time and energy over the years. They had coffee together in the damp, damaged kitchen, an odd reunion of adversaries who had reached a sort of unspoken truce born of sheer exhaustion. Brennan casually mentioned that he would be retiring soon, that his replacement would be a younger man from Lexington with no emotional ties to the old cases in the region. Mary nodded understandingly, both knowing that this was his way of saying a chapter was closing. Ruby began having vivid dreams that kept her awake in the middle of the night, her heart racing and her skin damp with cold sweat. These weren't conventional nightmares populated by monsters or impossible situations, but meticulously detailed reconstructions of specific moments from the past. She saw faces she had forgotten or suppressed, heard voices that time should have silenced, felt textures and temperatures of scenes that her conscious mind insisted had never occurred in the way the dreams presented them. She didn't share these experiences with Mary, fearing that articulating them would give them substance she preferred to keep in the nebulous realm of the subconscious. Mary, for her part, developed the habit of obsessively taking inventories of the property. She catalogued every object, every piece of furniture, every household utensil, with a precision bordering on ritual. She created lists in notebooks that she then hid in places known only to her. Ruby observed these activities with a mixture of confusion and concern, unable to discern whether they were symptoms of mental disintegration or desperate attempts to maintain some sense of control over a world that was increasingly slipping from her grasp. Perhaps both, Ruby thought. Perhaps there was no longer a clear distinction between sanity and madness, when one had lived for so long on the fringes of what was acceptable. The closest neighbors, who had previously kept a cautious distance from the sisters, began to show something bordering on pity. They occasionally brought baskets of food, offered help with urgent repairs, and expressed concern about how they would survive the coming winter. Mary accepted these offers with wounded pride but reluctant gratitude. Ruby reciprocated by baking cakes and pies, which she gave as gifts, maintaining the fiction that they were still functional and respectable members of the community. Everyone participated in this delicate dance of mutual pretense, each knowing but not saying that the Ashcroft sisters were slowly sinking into a swamp from which there was no escape. The winter of 1916 arrived with a ferocity that surprised even the oldest residents of Appalachia. Consecutive blizzards buried the lodge under layers of white that transformed the world into a lunar landscape, silent and hostile. Mary and Ruby found themselves completely isolated, their provisions dwindling each day, the cold penetrating through every crack and hole that the deteriorated structure could no longer seal. They burned furniture in the fireplace to keep warm, watching as chairs that had belonged to previous generations turned to ashes and smoke. Each sacrificed piece was a concession to immediate survival, a gradual abandonment of everything they had accumulated. Ruby began telling stories during those endless winter nights, tales of her childhood that Mary had forgotten or never fully known. She spoke of her father before the accident in the mines, of how he sang Irish songs while working in the small garden behind the cabin where they were born. She described her mother sewing by candlelight, her fingers moving with hypnotic precision across fabrics that transformed into dresses and shirts. There was a tenderness in these memories that contrasted sharply with the hardness the sisters had cultivated in their adult lives. Mary listened in silence, letting Ruby's words wash over her like warm water, temporarily dissolving the layers of cynicism and cruel pragmatism that had become her armor against the world. One morning, Mary couldn't get out of bed. The cough that had been her constant companion for years intensified during the night, leaving her too weak to perform even the most basic tasks. Ruby took on all the household duties, caring for her sister with a dedication that revealed depths of affection rarely expressed between them. She prepared nourishing broths that she fed Mary spoonful by spoonful. She changed cold compresses when the fever rose. She sat by Mary's bedside for hours, holding her hand as they both watched the daylight dance through the torn curtains. There was no doctor available during that brutal winter, no possibility of seeking professional help. Ruby relied on home remedies and silent prayers directed to deities she wasn't sure she believed in. When winter finally loosened its grip and the first wildflowers began to emerge through the melting snow, Mary had partially recovered. She remained frail, a diminished version of who she had been, but alive and determined not to succumb completely to the fate that seemed to have chosen her. Ruby had grown thin during those months of intensive care, her own resources drained by the effort of keeping them both functioning. They looked at each other and saw mirrors of their shared decline, two women who had walked together through territories most people only visited in nightmares. Spring brought unexpected visitors. A group of religious missionaries were traveling through the mountains, offering spiritual comfort and material assistance to isolated communities. They were genuinely kind people, motivated by sincere faith in their mission to alleviate suffering wherever they found it. They knocked on the inn's door and were greeted by Ruby, who initially considered refusing them, but realized that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. The missionaries entered and assessed the situation with eyes trained to recognize extreme need. They offered food, clothing, and help with urgent repairs. Mary watched from her armchair in the living room, suspicious of these expressions of charity that seemed to demand nothing in return. During the week the missionaries stayed in the region. They established a peculiar relationship with the sisters. They didn't press them on spiritual matters, nor did they ask intrusive questions about the past. They simply worked, fixing what they could, offering companionship without judgment. Ruby found herself conversing with one of the women in the group, a middle-aged lady with calloused hands and a tranquil smile. They talked about simple things, bread recipes, weather patterns, the austere beauty of the mountains. There was a comforting normalcy in these interactions that Ruby hadn't experienced in years. Mary kept a greater distance, but accepted the help with something approaching gratitude, although she never verbalized the feeling directly. When the missionaries left, they left behind not only supplies and repairs, but also a disturbing feeling that perhaps there were alternative ways of living that the sisters had never seriously considered. Ruby found herself questioning choices that had once seemed inevitable, paths they had taken without truly evaluating whether there were other options. Mary resisted these reflections, fearing that allowing regret to enter would mean completely collapsing under the weight of all they had done and been. There were doors that, once opened, could not be closed again. Both knew this instinctively. The summer of 1917 saw a final gasp of activity at the inn. A small group of natural history enthusiasts paid to stay for a few days while they studied the region's unique flora. They were academics from a university in Philadelphia, educated men who treated the sisters with formal but distant courtesy. Ruby prepared meals that impressed the visitors, proving that her culinary skills remained intact despite everything. Mary talked with them about the changes she had witnessed in the mountains over the years, offering insights that only decades of constant observation could provide. For brief moments, it was possible to pretend they were simply owners of a rural inn, nothing more. The academics departed, leaving behind generous payment and heartfelt praise for the hospitality they had received. Ruby counted the bills with trembling hands, realizing that this money represented the difference between surviving a few more months or facing impossible decisions immediately. Mary suggested they use some of the funds to hire help with major roof repairs before the next winter arrived. Ruby agreed, but both knew they were only postponing the inevitable. The inn was dying around them, and no amount of temporary patching could reverse the fundamental entropy consuming the structure cell by cell. During the long afternoons of that summer, The sisters developed the habit of sitting together on the porch, watching the sun set behind the distant peaks. They didn't talk much during these sessions, but there was deep communication in the shared silence. Decades of shared experiences, of secrets kept so deeply that they became part of their DNA, of loyalty that survived even when everything else crumbled. Ruby occasionally touched Mary's arm, a simple gesture that contained volumes of unarticulated meaning. Mary responded with a half-smile that acknowledged and accepted the comfort offered. They had been monsters, perhaps, but they were monsters who loved each other with an intensity that conventional people rarely experienced. Autumn painted the mountains again, an eternal cycle that would continue long after the Ashcroft sisters were nothing but a hazy memory. Ruby picked the last apples from the lone tree in the yard, making preserves that she stored in the dark cellar. Mary catalogued her diaries, tying them with faded red ribbon and placing them in a metal box which she locked with a padlock. They were preparing for something, though neither of them verbalized exactly what. There was a growing awareness that they were reaching the end of something, that the next chapter, whatever it might be, would be radically different from anything they had ever known. The first frosts of November crystallized the cobwebs that hung from the eaves of the inn, transforming them into silvery lace that shimmered in the dim morning light. Ruby discovered a strange beauty in this decay, an aesthetic of decay she had previously failed to appreciate. She walked through the empty rooms, observing how the dust danced in the sunbeams that filtered through the cracked windows, how the shadows stretched in ways that seemed to tell their own stories. Mary spent more time in her room, surrounded by books she obsessively reread, finding in yellowed pages a refuge that the physical world no longer offered. An antique dealer appeared in December, drawn by rumors that the inn contained valuable pieces of antique furniture. He was a small man with nervous gestures and eyes that assessed everything in monetary terms. Ruby guided him through the house, watching as he examined cabinets, tables, and chests of drawers with experienced hands that detected quality beneath layers of neglect. He made offers for several pieces, prices that seemed both insulting and tempting. Mary authorized the sale of some items, those without particular sentimental value, and watched as they were loaded onto the dealer's cart. Each object I broke created more empty space, more silence within walls that already contained too much silence. Ruby began writing letters to distant relatives she hadn't seen in years, cousins scattered across other states, aunts who had moved to big cities in search of opportunities non-existent in the mountains. Her letters were cautious, avoiding mentioning anything specific about their lives in recent decades, focusing on mundane things like weather and health. The replies, when they came, were equally superficial, polite but maintaining a safe distance. No one offered to visit or suggested they come for a temporary stay. Ruby understood perfectly. Reputation traveled faster than correspondence, and stories about the Ashcroft sisters had reached even the most distant members of their family tree. Mary began having long conversations with visitors only she could see. Ruby would find her in the second-floor hallway, talking animatedly to empty spaces, gesturing as if debating complex points with invisible interlocutors. Initially alarmed, Ruby eventually accepted these interactions as part of the new reality they inhabited. She didn't try to correct or question Mary about these visions. If her sister's mind was creating companionship that the physical world refused to offer, who was she to deny that comfort? Everyone found their own ways to survive the overwhelming loneliness that their existences had become. The year 1918 began with disturbing news of a disease spreading across the country, a particularly virulent influenza that claimed thousands of lives. The mountains offered some protection through isolation, but fear permeated even remote communities. Ruby intensified her precautions, refusing the few travelers who still occasionally appeared at the door, explaining that they could not risk exposure to the disease given Mary's fragile health. The truth was that seclusion had become more comfortable than interaction, that the idea of strangers invading her private sanctuary provoked anxiety that Ruby could barely control. During a stormy night in March, the old tree growing next to the inn was struck by lightning. The trunk split in two with a crash that shook the building's foundations, flaming branches falling dangerously close to the wooden walls. Mary and Ruby watched from the window, mesmerized by the spectacle of natural destruction. When the rain finally extinguished the flames, only a charred stump and twisted branches remained scattered across the yard. Ruby interpreted it as an omen, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Mary simply said that all living things eventually burned one way or another. A priest visited in April, not sent by the previous year's missionaries but on his own initiative after hearing about the sisters' situation. He was a young man, recently ordained and full of evangelistic fervor, not yet tempered by experience. He offered prayers, sacraments, and the opportunity for confession. Ruby listened politely, but refused his offers. Mary didn't even come down to meet him. The priest left looking confused and slightly offended, unable to understand that some souls don't seek redemption, because they don't believe such a thing exists. Ruby watched him walk down the dusty road and felt something that might have been remorse, but it could also have simply been weariness. The summer months passed in a warm haze of monotony. Ruby tended the garden with almost religious dedication, cultivating vegetables that provided basic nutrition but little joy. Mary stayed indoors, avoiding the sun that seemed to intensify her weakness. They read aloud to each other during the afternoons, classic works they had accumulated over the years. Words from authors dead centuries ago filled the air, offering windows to worlds they would never visit, lives they would never live. There was a peculiar solace in this literature, in the discovery that suffering and terrible choices were universal themes, not exclusive to their particular experiences. In September, Ruby found Mary's diary lying on the hallway floor, seemingly left there carelessly. The temptation to read it was almost physical in its intensity. Holding the leather volume in his trembling hands, Ruby struggled with conflicting impulses: knowledge versus respect, curiosity versus loyalty. Finally, he placed the diary back in the locked drawer in Mary's room without opening a single page. Some truths, he decided, were better left in the dark, where they had been carefully buried. Sisterhood sometimes meant protecting each other, not only from external forces, but also from the full revelations of who they truly were. Autumn brought subtle changes to the dynamic between the sisters. Mary began to speak more openly about death, not in a morbid way, but with a philosophical acceptance of its inevitability. She discussed practical arrangements, where she wanted to be buried, which personal belongings should be destroyed versus preserved. Ruby participated in these conversations with an outward calm that masked inner turmoil. The idea of existing without Mary was a concept her brain automatically rejected, like trying to imagine colors that human eyes cannot see. They had been one since before conscious memory. Separation was not only undesirable, it was ontologically impossible. On a particularly clear October night, the sisters sat on the porch watching a meteor shower streak across the sky with luminous, ephemeral trails. Ruby commented on how small, insignificant they were against the vastness of the cosmos. Mary agreed, adding that perhaps there was liberation in that insignificance, that their mistakes and sins mattered as much as those meteors mattered to the distant stars from which they had detached themselves. Ruby considered this and decided that her sister might be right. Perhaps the universe was too indifferent to judgment, and all the guilt they carried was merely a self-imposed burden they could choose to bear. November arrived with winds that stripped the last leaves from the trees, leaving bare branches against grey skies. The inn creaked constantly now, as if lamenting its own decrepitude. Ruby noticed new cracks appearing in the walls daily, evidence that the structure was literally falling apart. She made repairs where she could, but recognized a lost battle when she saw it. The building that had housed so many stories, guarded so many secrets, was finally succumbing to time and neglect. It was fitting, she thought. Stone and wood witnesses should not outlive those whose testimonies they carried. The winter of 1919 settled in with the familiarity of an unwanted but inevitable acquaintance. Ruby had stockpiled enough provisions to get through the harshest months, a skill learned from previous seasons of near starvation. The fireplace constantly consumed firewood that she herself chopped and stacked, arduous work that left her hands calloused and her back aching. Mary watched from her chair wrapped in blankets, offering silent company as Ruby performed the endless tasks that survival demanded. There was a comforting rhythm to these routines, a predictability that contrasted with the chaos that had characterized earlier periods of their lives. During a heavy snowy afternoon, Ruby found an old box in the attic that she didn't remember seeing before. It contained yellowed photographs, some so old that the faces had become ghostly, obscured by time and improper storage. She recognized her parents in some of the images, young and full of hope that life would subsequently crush. There were also photos of her own sisters when they were younger, looking at the camera with expressions that blended defiance and vulnerability. Ruby took the box downstairs and spent hours with Mary examining these visual fragments of the past that seemed to belong to completely different people. Mary held a particular photograph for a long time, studying it with an intensity that Ruby couldn't interpret. It was a picture of the inn in its glory days, before its deterioration, when the paint was still white and the windows gleamed without cracks. Two figures stood on the balcony, probably the sisters themselves, though they were too distant and blurry for definitive confirmation. Mary murmured something about how everything seemed possible back then, how they believed they could build something lasting. Ruby didn't answer, letting the remark float in the air like dust, dancing in the weak rays of the winter sun. The nights were filled with improvised narratives that the sisters wove together, stories about places they had never visited and lives they had never lived. They imagined themselves as merchants in exotic port cities, as teachers in rural schools teaching literacy to successive generations, as respected healers known for their wisdom about medicinal herbs. These fantasies offered temporary escape from the confined reality of their current existence. Ruby noticed that Mary became more animated during these storytelling sessions, as if imagination offered nourishment that physical food could no longer provide. January brought news via a messenger who struggled through the snow to deliver accumulated mail. Among the letters was an official notice informing them that the property had been assessed for back taxes. The amounts owed far exceeded any resources the sisters possessed. Ruby read the document repeatedly, as if multiple readings could alter its contents. Mary accepted the news with surprising equanimity, commenting that it was simply another step in the logical progression of events that had begun years before. Losing the inn was a fitting conclusion, she said, closing a circle that had begun with a questionable acquisition. Ruby considered her options limited. She could try to contest the assessment, seek an extension, plead for mercy from the tax authorities, but she recognized the futility of these efforts. The system wanted the property, and the system always eventually got what it wanted. There was also a part of her that felt a peculiar relief at the prospect of forced liberation. The inn had been simultaneously her home and her prison, a place of memories so dense that breathing there required conscious effort. Perhaps losing everything was exactly the absolution they needed, but could never voluntarily seek. Over the following weeks, the sisters began the process of emotionally separating themselves from the property they had inhabited for so long. Ruby systematically packed essential belongings into suitcases and boxes, creating an inventory of what they would take versus what would be abandoned. Mary distributed specific instructions regarding certain objects, some to be burned, others to be buried in the backyard where no one would ever find them. There was ritual in these activities, a farewell ceremony that acknowledged the importance of the place, while simultaneously releasing its hold on them. February saw the sisters receive an unexpected visit from the new sheriff, a man named Daniel Morrison, who had taken over the position after Brennan's retirement. Morrison was young and idealistic, still believing that law and justice were attainable synonyms. He had come to discuss the fiscal situation, but also, Ruby suspected, to personally assess the women about whom she had heard so many contradictory stories. Mary received him with cold courtesy, answering questions with the bare minimum of precision. Ruby offered him tea, which Morrison accepted more out of politeness than desire. The conversation carefully revolved around substantive topics, all participants aware of undercurrents that could not be directly mentioned. Morrison left leaving the impression that he was genuinely confused about what to think of the Ashcroft sisters. They weren't the dramatic villains the rumors suggested, but neither did they inspire easy trust or sympathy. They were simply two aging women living on the fringes of a society that had never truly embraced them. Ruby watched him ride down the road and imagined the report he would write, how he would try to frame experience within administrative categories that didn't encompass the nuances of their lived realities. March brought the first faint signs of spring, but inside the inn the weather remained perpetually wintry. Ruby noticed that Mary was sleeping longer and longer, waking only for meals before slipping back into dreams from which she returned with increasing reluctance. There was no access to doctors or treatments that could reverse what was clearly a progressive decline. Ruby sat beside Mary's bed during these long hours of sleep, sometimes reading aloud, other times simply keeping silent vigil. There was a deep intimacy in this care, love expressed through practical actions because words had never been comfortable tools for either of them. One afternoon, Mary awoke with unusual clarity and asked Ruby to bring her the locked diary. When Ruby hesitated, Mary firmly insisted she would not accept refusal. Ruby obeyed, watching as Mary removed specific pages from the volume, carefully tearing them and feeding them to the flames of the fireplace. The paper burned quickly, turning words into smoke that rose up the chimney and dispersed into the indifferent sky. Mary offered no explanation, and Ruby asked none. Some stories were destined to disappear without a trace, existing only in the memory of those who lived them and dying completely when those witnesses finally fell silent. The sisters spent the remaining days of March in a state of temporal suspension, existing in limbo between a past they couldn't undo and a future they couldn't clearly visualize. Ruby prepared meals that they ate without savoring them. Mary leafed through books without absorbing their content. They occasionally talked about trivialities, avoiding topics that truly mattered, because there were no solutions or resolutions available for any of the significant issues they faced. The outside world continued to spin, but within the walls of the inn, time had taken on a viscous quality, stretching and contracting in ways that defied conventional measurement. When April finally arrived with its renewed promises of rebirth and new beginnings, the sisters knew that such promises were not meant for them. They had transcended the normal cycle of seasons, now existing in territory where ordinary rules no longer applied. Ruby began making concrete plans for relocation after they inevitably lost their property. Mary participated in these planning discussions with polite but detached interest, as if they were talking about people they vaguely knew but who were not themselves. The end was coming, taking a specific form for the first time, and both recognized it with a complex mixture of terror and relief that neither could adequately articulate. The month of May transformed the mountains into an explosion of green life that contrasted painfully with the enclosed atmosphere inside the inn. Ruby opened the windows in the mornings to allow breezes laden with the scent of wildflowers to circulate through the rooms, attempting to dispel the heavy air of prolonged confinement. Mary remained in her favorite chair by the bedroom window, observing the outside world with an expression that Ruby couldn't fully decipher. There was acceptance there, but also something deeper, perhaps even a strange and tortuous kind of peace. The official letters continued to arrive with relentless regularity, each one further tightening the bureaucratic noose around the property. Ruby responded when necessary, her careful handwriting filling out forms she knew were mere empty formalities. The outcome was determined even before the process began. The inn would be seized by the county, auctioned off to cover accumulated debts, and the sisters would need to find another place to live. Ruby began discreetly investigating rooms for rent in neighboring communities, discovering that their reputation preceded them even in towns they had never personally visited. During a morning walk through the backyard, Ruby discovered that the flowers she had planted years before had multiplied wildly, creating a chaotic garden of colors and textures. There was no order or design, only exuberant growth following nature's own logic. Ruby spent hours in that makeshift garden, pulling weeds, rearranging plants, trying to impose some structure on the verdant chaos. It was futile work, she acknowledged, but it offered a welcome distraction from the worries that consumed her thoughts during moments of quiet. Mary watched from the window, occasionally waving when their gazes met through the fogged glass. June brought humid heat that turned the inn's interior into a stifling greenhouse. Ruby set up makeshift fans, hanging wet fabrics in drafts to create evaporative cooling. Mary endured the heat with a stoicism that Ruby secretly admired. She never complained, never demanded more than Ruby was already giving. There was dignity in this resignation that transcended mere pride or stubbornness. It was a fundamental acceptance that physical comfort was no longer a priority when more essential questions of existence remained unresolved. A bookseller visited, offering to buy the collection the sisters had amassed over decades. Ruby considered the offer, mentally calculating how much that extra money could help with their inevitable relocation. Mary, however, refused to sell. The books were companions, she said, their only friends who had never judged or betrayed them. Ruby didn't argue, understanding that some things had value that transcended money. She helped Mary pack the volumes carefully into boxes lined with soft fabric, treating each book as a precious relic of a civilization they had chosen to inhabit only partially. Summer nights were filled with the sounds of the surrounding forest, a chorus of insects and nocturnal animals creating a natural symphony. Ruby and Mary sat on the porch despite the persistent heat, allowing the darkness to envelop them like a protective blanket. They spoke less now, communicating through a shared language of gestures and sighs that decades of intimacy had developed. Ruby held Mary's hand, feeling the fragility of the bones beneath paper-thin skin. Mary squeezed back with surprising strength, conveying messages that words could never adequately articulate. In July, the auction of the property was officially announced, with the date set for the end of August. Ruby read the notice published in the county newspaper, seeing her house reduced to a technical description of dimensions and structural features. It didn't mention the stories contained within those walls, the lives that had been lived and perhaps ended there, secrets buried so deep that archaeological excavation would never unearth them. It was just real estate with depreciated market value, nothing more. Ruby carefully folded the newspaper and placed it on the fireplace, watching the flames consume the words that reduced her existence to a tradable commodity. Mary began giving Ruby final instructions during those weeks of July, not a formal will, as they had little of material value to bequeath, but guidelines on how Ruby should proceed after her inevitable death. Mary spoke of these things with a calmness that initially disturbed Ruby, but which she eventually recognized as a generous gift. She was preparing the way, easing the transition that they both knew was approaching. Ruby listened and memorized every word, asking practical questions when necessary, avoiding emotional displays that would only make the process more difficult for both of them. August arrived with dramatic storms that swept through the valleys, with theatrical fury. Thunder echoed between the mountain peaks like celestial artillery, lightning momentarily illuminating landscapes normally hidden by the darkness of night. Ruby found herself awake during these storms, observing the spectacle through windows that trembled under the force of the winds. Mary slept through the turbulence, her breathing steady and calm despite the chaos outside. Ruby envied this ability to find peace amidst the storm, literally and metaphorically. The week of the auction brought curious visitors who wandered through the property assessing potential purchases. Ruby guided them with mechanical courtesy, answering questions about the building's structural condition and history, while carefully omitting aspects she felt wouldn't contribute to a sale. Mary refused to participate in these visits, remaining in her room with the door closed, preserving the last bastion of privacy in a home that was being systematically invaded and catalogued by strangers. Ruby understood and respected this need for isolation, serving as a barrier between Mary and the outside world, which had never adequately understood or accommodated its complexities. The day of the auction dawned clear and cloudless, a deep blue sky that seemed to mock the gravity of the occasion. Ruby wore her best dress, black and austere, appropriate for the funeral it was. Mary refused to come down, saying that Ruby should represent them in their shared capacity. The auctioneer was a middle-aged man with a powerful voice, trained to project over crowds. Ruby watched from a distance as he conducted the proceedings, accepting bids from people whose faces she vaguely recognized from years of living in the area. When the gavel finally fell, announcing the sale concluded, Ruby felt something inside her silently break, a clean crack that divided before from after, with surgical precision. The buyer was a local farmer who planned to demolish the inn and use the land to expand his agricultural operations. He offered the sisters a month to relocate, a generosity Ruby accepted with genuine gratitude, despite the pain that accompanied need. During that final month, they began the process of dismantling the life they had built brick by brick, memory by memory. Ruby packed systematically while Mary watched, occasionally pointing out specific objects with instructions about their destination. There was ritual in this process, a sacredness in parting that acknowledged importance while releasing attachment. The last weeks of August passed in a haze of frantic activity and suppressed emotion. Ruby arranged transport for her belongings, negotiated the rental of a small house in a community 3 valleys away, and made all the practical arrangements that the transition required. Mary approved each decision with silent nods, trusting Ruby to navigate complexities that she herself no longer had the energy to face. When the day finally came to leave, both looked back one last time at the structure that had been the stage for so much, a silent witness to lives lived in the shadows between respectability and ruin. The small house Ruby had rented was on the outskirts of a forgotten village, just a few buildings scattered among the hills. The place exuded quietude, as if the very air conspired to keep secrets well guarded. The residence was modest, 2 main rooms with windows that captured the morning light in a melancholic way. Mary chose the smaller room, the one that faced the back where the trees created a green barrier against memories they preferred to leave behind. The days began to blend into one another, with that timeless quality that seclusion brings. Ruby tended the house with meticulous dedication, maintaining routines that gave structure to existences that had lost so many of their original points of reference. Mary spent long hours at the window, watching the seasons change through the fogged glass. As if watching a spectacle in which she was no longer an active part, there was a silent acceptance in her gaze, a strange peace that Ruby couldn't quite name. Autumn brought its dramatic colors, painting the outside world with hues that seemed excessively vivid compared to the subdued atmosphere of the house. Ruby brewed herbal teas made from herbs she gathered nearby, blends that filled the rooms with comforting aromas. Mary drank slowly, holding the cup with hands that trembled slightly, savoring the warmth more than the taste itself. They spoke little now, having exhausted the need for words after decades of mutual understanding that transcended verbal language. The neighbors kept a respectful distance, exchanging polite greetings when they inevitably crossed paths, but nothing that suggested intimacy or genuine curiosity. Ruby appreciated this relative anonymity, the possibility of existing without the constant weight of inquisitive stares. She bought provisions at the small local store, exchanged trivialities about the weather, and returned to the silent sanctuary they had created. There was a liberating simplicity in this existence, reduced to its most essential elements. Winter arrived with its relentless whiteness, covering the world's imperfections under layers of snow that made everything uniformly pure in appearance. Ruby ensured they had enough firewood, heavy blankets, everything they might need to get through the cold months without relying on outside help. Mary watched these preparations with silent gratitude, recognizing the care Ruby invested in maintaining some comfort in their increasingly cramped lives. During the endless afternoons, Ruby read aloud from books they had carried through multiple moves, mostly poetry, verses that captured truths that straightforward prose couldn't reach. Mary would close her eyes, absorbing the words as if they were nourishment for parts of herself that ordinary food couldn't feed. There was a comforting ritual in these readings, a connection that persisted even when other forms of communication began to fail. Spring eventually melted the snows, revealing earth that had waited patiently beneath the ice. Ruby planted a small garden, mostly flowers, bursts of color that served only the purpose of existing beautifully. Mary watched from the window, waving occasionally when Ruby looked in her direction. There was a quiet harmony in this division of labor, one understanding that she needed to keep busy, while the other simply needed to be a silent witness to the world continuing to turn. The months passed with that fluid quality that time takes on when we stop marking it with significant events. Ruby and Mary existed in their own private bubble, protected by geographical isolation and the general disinterest of a community that had its own concerns. There were no great revelations or dramatic moments, just the natural progression of lives reaching their inevitable conclusions. Ruby knew that one day she would wake up and find Mary at peace, and when that day came, she would continue alone because that's what survivors did. The surrounding mountains remained indifferent, towering against skies that shifted from deep blue to stormy gray and back again. They had witnessed countless human lives unfold on their slopes, each convinced of its own unique importance, all eventually dissolving into the oblivion that time democratically grants to all. Ruby sometimes thought about this during her solitary walks, about how her particular stories would be just a few more among millions that the mountains would keep hidden. There was a kind of solace in this broader perspective, in the understanding that their mistakes and successes mattered less than they had imagined. The universe would remain indifferent, the seasons would continue their eternal cycle, and everything they had been would eventually be completely forgotten. It wasn't a depressing thought, but a strangely liberating one. It allowed Ruby to release some of the burdens she had carried, not through formal forgiveness or structured redemption, but simply through the recognition that in the grand scheme of things, they were just two people trying to survive as best they could. The afternoons were filled with comfortable silences, Ruby knitting while Mary dozed, the soft sound of the needles creating a meditative rhythm that marked the passage of hours. When Mary woke, they sometimes shared fragmented memories, not of the inn or the difficult years, but of even earlier moments when they were young and the world seemed full of unrealized possibilities. Ruby noticed how these memories became increasingly hazy, details evaporating like dew under the morning sun, leaving only emotional impressions of feelings long since felt. The cycle of the seasons continued its eternal dance, each bringing its own particular beauties and challenges. Ruby adapted to the rhythm of this simplified existence, finding meaning in small, repetitive tasks that she would previously have considered insignificant. There was wisdom in this simplicity, an understanding that life was less about grand dramatic gestures and more about accumulating thousands of small moments that together formed something that could be called a complete existence, if not exactly happy in the conventional sense. Mary eventually passed away one quiet winter night, gliding peacefully from one kind of sleep to another. Ruby discovered her the following morning, and there was a moment of pure stillness where she simply sat beside her sister, holding her cold hand and silently giving thanks for all the years they had shared, for the understanding that never needed to be articulated, for the loyalty that had survived everything the world threw at them. Ruby continued alone for some time, maintaining the house, tending the garden, reading aloud to empty walls because the habit was too ingrained to break. She didn't seek companionship or try to rebuild connections with the wider world. There was completeness in her solitude, a feeling that she had fulfilled a purpose defined long ago in circumstances that now seemed to belong to another life entirely. The Ashcroft sisters lived and died in the shadows of Appalachia, their stories known only fragmentarily, interpreted through lenses of suspicion and speculation. The complete truth remained with them, buried first with Mary and then with Ruby, secrets that time would eventually dissolve into nothing more than vague whispers, passed down through generations that would gradually lose interest even in whispering. The mountains remain there, indifferent and eternal, guarding stories they will never fully tell. And perhaps it is fitting that some narratives remain mysterious, resisting definitive conclusions or final judgments. We merely observe from afar, trying to understand lives lived according to logics we may never fully comprehend, accepting that not all stories have clear resolutions or evident morals. If you've made it this far, subscribe to the channel for more stories from the forgotten shadows of history. Leave a like and share in the comments